Tonight, 3 more police officers charged over the death of George Floyd, as Donald Trump faces an extraordinary pushback from military officials. Also tonight, concerns that the planned protest in Melbourne against police brutality poses real health risks for all Victorians. The government splashes cash on the construction industry, but access to the grants doesn't come cheap. And offering comfort but fleecing their victims. Warnings of a spiritual healing scam targeting vulnerable people. Good evening, Mary Gearin with ABC News. All 4 police officers involved in George Floyd's killing have now been charged, but it didn't stop protests erupting across the US for the 9th straight day. Hundreds of thousands gathered in mostly peaceful protests, with George Floyd's brother returning to the scene of his death to kneel in silence. Former President Barack Obama also lent his support to the growing movement, urging the activists to ensure they turn their anger into change. North America correspondent David Lipson reports from Washington.
Day by day, as the chaos subsides, a movement is growing, led by a new generation of young, peaceful activists. In cities like Los Angeles and Portland, huge crowds are turning out. And it's happening in small towns too. Marches in Crown Point, Indiana showed they'll no longer be intimidated.
Would you stand here watching while I beg for my life?
And the protesters are already seeing results. These are the 3 officers who stood by as George Floyd slowly died. They're now charged with aiding and abetting murder. And Derek Chauvin, the officer who kneeled on his neck, has had his charge upgraded.
I believe the evidence available to us now supports the stronger charge of second-degree murder.
George Floyd's son returned to the scene of the crime and kneeled in silence. News of the arrests didn't ease his grief.
I am happy that all the officers have been arrested. My father have not been killed like this. We deserve justice. That's all I have to say.
On the protest front lines, the news was welcomed, but no one thinks this fight is over.
George Floyd, that's just a step. You know, there's way more victims out there that need prosecution.
This is not the end of anything. This is the beginning of a lot of things. This is a issue that we've been dealing with for hundreds of years.
Today, it also emerged that George Floyd had tested positive for coronavirus, another crisis hitting African Americans harder. The country's first black president urged protesters to maintain their momentum.
Historically, so much of the progress that we've made in our society has been because of young people.
Barack Obama was elected to power on a promise of change, but at the end of 8 years, America wasn't that different. Well, today, 4 years later, it does start to feel like change is in the air. The question is whether that momentum will hold.
Beyond a cry for justice, the protesters' end goal hasn't yet taken shape. But they're determined to find it together. David Lipson, ABC News, Washington.
And as Donald Trump tries to quell the ongoing protests, he's now facing an unprecedented revolt from some of his country's most senior and trusted military officials. In a stinging rebuke, former Defence Secretary and retired General James Mattis has accused the president of deliberately dividing the country. Other senior officials are speaking out too, including the serving Defence Secretary. Zoe Daniel reports.
Donald Trump has flagged using soldiers to enforce the law. But for Defence Secretary Mark Esper, that's a red line that shouldn't be crossed unless it's unavoidable.
The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now.
Amid concerns that the president may try to impose martial law, there are more police, heavily armed and in fatigues on DC's streets. Triggering the 1807 Insurrection Act would give the federal government authority to deploy the military to control civil disorder.
You have to have a dominant force. Maybe it doesn't sound good to say it, but you have to have a dominant force. We need law and order.
The president's rhetoric has provoked a blast from his former Defence Secretary James Mattis, who said Americans must reject any thinking of US cities as a battle space to be dominated by the military. Also expressing disbelief that troops may be ordered to violate the constitutional rights of their fellow citizens.
I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Mattis ultimately left the White House at the end of 2018 after disagreements with the president. He was the last of a trio of generals referred to as the adults in the room, including H.R. McMaster and John Kelly, who eventually left or was sacked by a president who tends to eject dissenters. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a memo to his colleagues to remain true to their oath to defend the Constitution, including freedom of speech and the right to peaceful assembly. Zoe Daniel, ABC News.
Thousands of people have marched in London against police violence and racial injustice following George Floyd's death. There were some clashes with police as the demonstrators moved through the British capital, blocking traffic. The protest was organised by the Black Lives Matter group.
Black lives have always mattered. We have always been important. We have always meant something. We have always succeeded.
2 Australian journalists were attacked on air while covering the demonstrations, but neither was injured. Back at home, this weekend's Victorian Black Lives Matter rally is causing headaches for authorities trying to contain the coronavirus. With thousands of people set to attend, the Premier has urged people to stay home for their own safety, but has stopped short of asking organisers to call off the event. And this afternoon, the state's chief medico issued his own plea for Victorians to stay away. Here's state political reporter Richard Willingham.
The space under Melbourne is growing. 4 tunnel boring machines are now inching their way under the city as part of the Metro Tunnel project. But the Premier has found himself in a political hole over a planned protest, and the opposition has its shovel ready.
We've had ironclad directions from this government for the last 2 months with regards to school closures, recreational fishing, golf, the opening of small businesses.
The rule book is out the window on Saturday because Daniel Andrews will not show consistency on this matter.
With thousands potentially set to defy the health advice to avoid mass gatherings and march for an end to black deaths in custody at Parliament, the government is now urging people to stay away.
People should not be protesting, whether it be on this issue or any other issue. It's not safe. But I think it's pretty clear, Rich, that there's a number of people who are going to be there on Saturday. I'm not encouraging them.
But we're a free country, and there is a right to peacefully protest, and I'm sure it's not beyond the wits and imagination of those who wish to do that in a safe way, and I would encourage them to do so.
Chief Health Officer Brett Sutton has also voiced his concerns, saying it was not the time for thousands of people to gather when the country was still in the middle of a pandemic, warning the protests carried real risks. He's urging people to consider other ways to show their support. In the Parliament today, the opposition leader kept his focus on China.
Has he called a meeting of this working group to actually stand up for Victorian barley growers?
No road is too low for you. That's the point.
But it's the protest on the steps of the building that has everyone worried.
And we're joined now by Richard Willingham from Parliament. Rich, is this a change of rhetoric from the Premier?
Well, it's certainly been a difficult situation for the government, given the police have said they're going to use their discretion whether to fine people or not that turn up to this mass gathering simply because there's so many people that might come here. But I guess it flies in the face of that tough rhetoric we've heard in Victoria for the last 2 months that if you breach social distancing rules, Victorians will die. But this today was a change from the Premier's rhetoric to yesterday, where it was a little bit softer. Today he's making that message clear, and even though this is a very sensitive issue, they still continue to say that this will be dangerous if people turn up on Saturday.
And Rich, Parliament's been busy this week. It's also set up an inquiry into the forced closure of a Melbourne catering company.
iCook Foods was closed last year by the Department of Health and Human Services and the Dandenong Council over a listeria outbreak and 96 other food breaches. Now, when Mr Cook, the owner of that business, has always denied any charges, and he even claimed that there was a slug planted in his kitchen, which was one of those charges. Now, when that went to court, all those charges were dropped and he was cleared of any listeria. He says that the proper process has not been followed when he was shut down, and some MPs here at the Parliament believe him and have set up an inquiry to examine whether the process was followed and whether there was a conflict of interest. Now, at the time, the Dandenong Council was also a stakeholder in a rival catering business, which is since in the process of being sold to the state government. Here's the inquiry chair, Fiona Patton.
There is a lot of concern about what went on that led to those 96 charges, and then what was obvious is that they were all false charges because they were all dropped. So how did this happen? Who did it? And how can we ensure that this never happens again?
Now, the government says that it makes no apologies for closing down that business at the time to protect the public health. It says the inquiry is a matter for the Parliament, whereas the Dandenong Council welcomes the investigation. Mary?
Richard Willingham, thank you. The housing industry is reporting a sudden surge in buyer interest now that $700 million worth of subsidies are being pumped into the building market. The grant scheme became available as soon as it was launched by the Prime Minister, and some buyers took advantage of the extra $25,000 immediately. Here's National Affairs correspondent Greg Jennett.
The elbows were out.
Nice to meet you. You too. Thank you.
And in -3 degrees, the hands were too.
Oh, we can't do those high-fiving.
Long enough to dig out almost $700 million.
Well, we're here to tell them that we're going to keep that dream alive for them.
Today's announcement is designed to get our tradies back to work.
The industry had watched orders for new homes and renovations freeze in the isolation period.
We were facing the valley of death towards hundreds of thousands of job losses.
In an economic valley that now has another name.
I really didn't want to see a recession ever again in Australia.
The government assumes its subsidies will kickstart new housing work worth up to $10 billion.
Hey, buddy. Hey, how are you?
To get the $25,000, contracts must be signed between today and the end of the year, and only with a licensed builder or contractor. For a new home, up to $750,000, or a major renovation on an existing home. But to be eligible, a couple can earn no more than $200,000 a year, or a single $125,000. There are limits on the value of the properties to be built or worked on. Pools, tennis courts and sheds won't be covered either.
For a lot of tradies, all they're going to be building is a longer line out the front of Centrelink.
The package has set off an early bun rush, but it is limited. Because contracts have to be signed before New Year's Day, anyone who hasn't by now at least given thought to those cumbersome design and council approvals faces an uphill battle to have their project included. Then again, if buyers are ready, as Vivek Agarwal was, to sign up today, the windfall's a bonanza.
It's like a jackpot. You're winning a jackpot of 25 grains.
The same goes for Alex Ball and Alex Rowan.
Pretty ecstatic.
Yeah, pretty excited.
With state first homeowners incentives, they're $40,000 better off and reaching their deposit.
That leads out to the park.
On the Sunshine Coast, that valley of death suddenly sounding lush again.
I'm sure that we'll see a bring forward of demand over the next few weeks.
Come on.
When $700 million's being showered about on housing.
Hey guys, I've just reseeded that.
The green grass of homes, the least to expect.
Make sure you get off that bloke's lawn.
Greg Jennett, ABC News, Canberra.
Australia may have just snuck into a recession on the GDP numbers, but they don't tell the full story, and neither does the official unemployment rate. A collapse in work hours is behind the pain for many Australians, and some economists are warning that the recession could become a depression if the government withdraws its economic stimulus. Stephen Long reports.
Some waterproofing.
Yeah, have you got brushes up there?
I'll send it right down, please.
Jeremy Sims repairs roofs for a living. His partner, Anna, isn't normally his offsider. She was working full-time as growth and operations manager for a tech startup before COVID-19 hit. She was stood down without pay as the economy slumped into recession. So now you're on the tools.
I'm on the tools. Yes, keeps me busy, keeps me active, which is good.
All right, ready?
That's putting a brave face on it. Anna's was the stable income the couple relied on. JobKeeper's only restored some of her hours and income. How much money are you down at the moment?
More than half my income with the job subsidy. So, you know, still, and that's quite a bit of money when you look at it.
Jeremy still has full-time work, but he's employing fewer people.
Now we're down to just two of us, really. So, plus Anna, who helps me, obviously.
Right.
Far more than the headline unemployment rate, a collapse in work hours for the economy shows the extent of the recession we're now in. The Reserve Bank is using the fall in work hours to assess the extent of the downturn. It was expecting a 20% fall in overall hours worked in the economy. Now it's hoping for a mere 15%, which is still shocking.
I'm worried what's going to happen once the JobKeeper, JobSeeker, the banks, all the extra benefits stop. And once it all comes to a halt, what happens then?
Economist Alison Pennington argues that withdrawing the government stimulus would be madness.
We're staring down the barrel of a depression Mark II. The business-led economy that we had coming into this crisis will fail to pull us out of it.
How bad do you think it could get?
Bad enough that I don't want to invest in anything at all.
Government programs are plugging some of the holes for now, but the economy needs long-term repair. Stephen Long, ABC News.
A young woman has been charged over the killing of Victorian greyhound trainer Gearin. 25-year-old Jessie Moore was charged with murder this morning. She's heavily pregnant and her defence lawyer has told the Melbourne Magistrates Court she's due next week. She did not appear in court. Gearin's body was found at her Devon Meadows home last week. She was a well-respected dog breeder and trainer. Moore is due back in court in August. The widow of a heart surgeon is suing the hospital he worked for, claiming it failed to provide a safe workplace despite a history of aggressive behaviour at the site. Patrick Pritzwald-Stegman was killed in a one-punch attack in 2017. Danny Tran reports.
It was men like Joseph Esmaili who the loved ones of Patrick Pritzwald-Stegman say he should have been shielded from. And now they've taken that belief to the Supreme Court, claiming Eastern Health failed to protect the surgeon and father of two. Christine Baumberg and her twin daughters Elsa and Sophia are suing the hospital network for negligence, claiming it failed to review safety practices despite a history of aggressive incidents in the lead up to Mr Pritzwald-Stegman's death. In February 2017, the 41-year-old was on his way home when he asked Esmaili to stop smoking outside the hospital's entrance. Esmaili began abusing the respected surgeon and then, without warning, he punched him before fleeing. Patrick Pritzwald-Stegman never woke from a coma and died about a month later. Esmaili has been jailed for more than a decade after being convicted of manslaughter. Mr Pritzwald-Stegman's family says Eastern Health failed to implement adequate security levels or provide appropriate training. His death has caused them extreme mental anguish and they're suing the hospital network for damages, including loss of income. In a statement, Eastern Health said this was a terrible incident and it'll be reviewing the documents. Danny Tran, ABC News, Melbourne.
Police are investigating a spiritual healing scam targeting women in Melbourne's Russian community. Two women have lost tens of thousands of dollars after handing over valuables to women who claimed they could heal them. As Margaret Paul reports, police think there might be more victims.
Inga was at a shopping centre in February when she says an older woman approached her, speaking in Russian.
He hold my hand. I start to say, oh, you have something problem, you have something bad, and hold my two hands and look in my eyes.
Inga was persuaded to drive home and return to the shopping centre with all her valuables, cash and jewellery, wrapped in a scarf. Then, in full view of other shoppers, the scarf containing Inga's valuables was swapped for a pile of stones during a prayer session.
It's very wrong. It's targeting people during already difficult times and stealing
and taking all their valuables?
Because I believe people. It's my problem. I don't believe it has been happened.
Police have released this vision of 3 women they want to speak to about Inga's case and about a similar case in St Kilda 3 days later. Police say the group is targeting women in Melbourne's Russian community, approaching them on the streets and in shopping centres. And it's likely there are more victims.
It's not something to be embarrassed about. We want to be able to help you, and we also want to hold these women to account.
Anyone with information is being urged to contact police. Margaret Paul, ABC News, Melbourne.
Well, after a tough few years fighting drought and then bushfires, Victorian farmers have, on occasion, looked to the generosity of the community to get by. But now they want to give something back. Eden Hennanen has met some of the generous donors.
Bendigo farmer Brendan Williams understands what it's like to do it tough. But after leaning on Australians to help them through the drought, farmers are now looking to return the favour.
The boot's on the other foot. You know, these people in the towns and the cities are really hurting, and I think it's important that we step up.
He's donated 10,000 kilograms of chickpeas to help produce more than 200,000 meals for those in need.
We could sell it, but realistically, you know, I think this is the time where, you know, we need to show the community that, yeah, we care, and so we're happy to donate it.
And across the state, others are joining the cause.
Here at the Harcourt Cool Room, apples are being boxed up to be sent to regional food shares across the state. But it's not just apples coming through these doors. At the moment, there's 10,000 kilograms of fresh fruit and vegetables that are being boxed up. But Bendigo Food Share hopes there's more to come in the coming months.
People may feel really insecure with their jobs at the moment, and being able to access a meal, being able to access a bag of groceries, hopefully will just take a bit of that stress off them.
It's really excellent that the farmers that are in that local community are supporting that local community. So setting up those hubs all the way around the state and even across the country.
The farmers involved hope it's the start of something special.
COVID-19, I think, has been the genesis of all of this, but I think it is only the genesis. I think we can expand on it going forward.
A labour of love in a time of need. Eden Hennanen, ABC News, Bendigo.
New analysis from Australian scientists has found around 15% of people with coronavirus don't have symptoms. And unless they're tested, they won't know they have it. It's why experts are urging Australians to stay vigilant with distancing. Here's medical reporter Sophie Scott.
Look at them jumping.
Sydney couple Bev and John Cable can now share a laugh about the bucket list trip that didn't go as planned.
Groundhog Day.
When a crew member became ill, everyone on the ship was confined to cabins and tested for coronavirus.
I've always had a little bit of a weak chest, so I was slightly concerned, but I didn't have any symptoms.
With the ship stranded off Uruguay, the grandparents were stunned to learn they tested positive to the virus.
If we were positive, then it didn't show in any other way than a piece of paper.
Despite both being in their 70s, a high-risk age group for COVID-19, they remained perfectly well, never getting any symptoms at all. Researchers from Bond University now believe about 15% of people who contract COVID-19 will be asymptomatic, like the Cables.
So for every 6 people who develop the infection, that is the COVID-19, about one of those 6 or 1 in 7 will not have any symptoms for the whole of the illness.
They examined 9 overseas studies, totalling around 20,000 asymptomatic coronavirus cases. Fortunately, patients without symptoms were 1/3 less likely to spread the disease.
You're not doing the things like coughing or sneezing because you don't have symptoms.
While the research confirms that only a small number of people are wandering around the community not knowing they have COVID-19, experts warn people can't become complacent.
You go to a restaurant, you go to the gym, you go to a protest, you don't know if the person next to you is infected or not, and they may not know either.
While their trip was one to remember, the Cables haven't been put off. They've already booked another cruise once border restrictions are lifted. Sophie Scott, ABC News.
To finance now, and the local share market had its fourth rise in a row today, but the Aussie dollar slipped back. Here's Alan Kohler.
Well, the share market has risen by an average of 1% a day this week, which is pretty remarkable considering we learnt yesterday that the country is in recession, and the day before the Reserve Bank Governor said it's the biggest economic contraction since the 1930s. And apart from that, the world is falling apart. Today's gains were led by shopping centres like Unibail, Rodamco, Westfield, and travel companies like Qantas and Flight Centre, because investors are focused on the future reopening of the economy rather than past closures. And on one measure, restaurant bookings, Australia is setting the global pace behind Germany. In more sobering news, we got some retail sales data for April today, down 17.7% from the 8.5% increase in March. But within that, clothing and footwear sales fell 50%. And here's the reason building companies have been pleading for help, which the government gave them today with the $25,000 grants. New construction orders have fallen by more than 50%. The rise in our market today followed a fourth consecutive day of gains in the United States, where investors are apparently unconcerned about the riots. But it's worth noting again that it's all focused on 6 companies: Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Netflix and Microsoft. Those stocks have passed their previous peak, and since the start of last year are up 70%, while the rest of the US market is up only 15%, and the rest of the world is barely up at all. Finally, the Australian dollar has slipped back below 69 US cents. And that's finance.
Sydney Roosters star James Tedesco has become the first NRL player to be ruled out of the game due to the coronavirus prevention measures. The fullback's been ruled out of tonight's game against the Broncos in Brisbane after recording a high temperature. Meanwhile, as Melbourne Storm wants to bounce back from last week's disappointing effort, Souths will be trying to improve their poor record in Melbourne when the teams meet tomorrow night. The Rabbitohs are yet to beat the Storm in Melbourne after 15 attempts. Souths coach Wayne Bennett says the absence of Storm fans at the game doesn't improve his team's hopes of a breakthrough win.
Well, the best chance we've got is us going down there and playing well. That's our best chance, whether we've got crowds or not. I don't think the players have really noticed that as much as you might think. They get out there, they train every day without any crowds.
Melbourne concedes it'll need to change up its game, tweak its structure to suit the competition's new rules. Now with the weather, here's Paul Higgins.
And Mary, you had to watch out for slippery leaves this morning on the paths around town as the day got off to a frosty start, especially across western and northern Victoria, where it dropped down to -2 at Casterton and Rutherglen. At Mount Hotham Airport, -5. And snowmaking is underway at Hotham and Falls Creek, just under 3 weeks before the delayed season begins. Cape Nelson, Mildura and Swan Hill were mildest today with 16 degrees. Around Melbourne, cloudy skies at first kept the morning from getting too cold, and then a sunny high of 13.8 in the city at 10:57 this morning. But it will be colder tonight. Right now in the backyard, down to 8 degrees in the city, only 5 in the Yarra Valley. This time last year, Melbourne's dams are around half full. Tonight, they're sitting at 63.4% full. A chilly -3 in Canberra this morning, the coldest so far this year. Blue skies and 26 across in Perth. And much of the continent's been under clear skies today. We do have this weak cold front down here making its way towards us. Now, it is going to be a dry Friday for the most part under high pressure. This front will brush past southern Victoria tomorrow night, but then a new high will move in during Sunday. So some showers late tomorrow near our coast and a shower or two on Saturday in our south. Tomorrow around the nation, coastal showers for Queensland and in Tasmania. So Hobart's in for some showers, but dry in Brisbane and sunny skies over Perth, Adelaide, Canberra and also Sydney. Back home, just looking at these overnight temperatures will get you shivering. Clear skies and light winds will bring widespread frost inland, some morning fog patches as well. It'll be mostly sunny in the morning, but cloud increasing in the south with some late showers near the coast. And there is a statewide frost warning, severe frost in the northeast. On the bays, a west to northwest wind below 10 knots. Well, if you haven't dug out the electric blanket yet, tonight might just convince you. 3 degrees over most of Melbourne, 5 in the city, 14 at top tomorrow. Early frost and fog, then a mostly sunny morning, bit of cloud in the afternoon, and we'll have light winds. Your long weekend will begin with a partly cloudy Saturday, morning fog and a brief shower or two, light winds and 13. Sunday, a shower or two in the morning, cloudy with a southerly wind 13. The Queen's birthday holiday Monday, a chilly, foggy morning, then a partly cloudy 13. 14 Tuesday becoming sunny and partly cloudy Wednesday and Thursday, Mary.
Thanks, Paul. And that's it for tonight. Laura Tingle is up next with 7:30.